Hey, I want to take a little bit of time and walk through this chapter on Judaism, really kind of looking at the broader narrative, particularly from the book here, and then I'll try to do some supplemental stuff regarding some of the practices, some of the holidays. But I think the book does a pretty good job with that. If you want to look at a narrative, if we're going to use McIntyre's definition or definition of a tradition that is historically extended, socially embodied, and that there's an argument. I think there's a really good argument to support the claim that Judaism, maybe more than any other religion, is a religion that is founded with a narrative, with a story. And so I want to just take the time to kind of spend recounting that story and allowing that to be the basis of a lot of the stuff that we're going to do for this chapter. So I'll put this slide on the wire. You can see some of the learning objectives, and really this is just drawn almost directly from the book. But I think that this quote is pretty interesting, that God wants us to effectively be his partner in helping the world, in repairing the world, and improving the conditions of the people and the civilizations around us. That seems to me to do a pretty good job of defining what Judaism is all about. It's about a people who believe that God chose them to be God's people for the world. To partner in helping the world, to repairing the world back to what God intended it to be. And so it is very much a this world religion. So we're going to look at a few different things here. For sure, if you know somebody who is Jewish, you probably know that it's a fairly diverse group of people, and it's a fairly diverse religion. And so I think that at the very beginning, it's important to note that whenever we use the word Jewish or Judaism, particularly Jewish, we are referencing maybe two things, and maybe sometimes these are very different. A diverse ethnic group. So a lot of my friends that are Jewish, they are ethnically Jewish. They are from that tribe, those people, if you will. And some of them are religious, and some of them are not. And so whenever we are talking about Jewish or Judaism, we're talking about an ethnic group, people who of a specific ethnicity, and then we're also talking about a religious tradition. Again, not all Jews are religious. Not all Jews believe in God. And so that is really kind of indicative of that sort of a setting. So Israel is important, and I'm going to get there in a second. But Jacob, if you know the stories of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Jacob was renamed Israel. And Israel really means one who wrestles or struggles with God. And so the name of Israel is really important here. And then they really strive to follow the Torah, the teachings. We oftentimes refer to that as the law, but in Hebrew it really means the teachings. And of course, this is a people, like I said, who have a long history and a long story, and that includes high water marks, and of course it includes low water marks as well. So I want to be able to differentiate between what we call biblical and rabbinic Judaism. And so be sure you understand kind of like the sacred texts. For sure, the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, the writings, and the prophets, if you take this down into Hebrew, that's what that word means. And this is the Hebrew Bible. It was completed in the 2nd century, generally in response to the development of Christianity and the spread of Christianity, whereas Jewish people were trying to distinguish themselves from Christians. And so the Hebrew Bible was really completed in the 2nd century BCE. And after about 135 of the Common Era, we see kind of the end of like true biblical Judaism, and then we start to see the beginning of rabbinic Judaism. We see that earlier for sure, but 135 is kind of where a lot of scholars put that end there. And then we have the Talmud, which is a collection of commentary on writings. The way I often think about this is that the Talmud is similar to the precedent that we have in our country with the Supreme Court, that there is commentary on law that evolves and that changes over time. So what is this narrative? Again, I think this is the main point of my recording this video. Similar to Judaism and Christianity and Islam, all three of these traditions go back to Abraham. And Abraham was a monotheist. He was one who believed in one God. And the tradition really traces itself back to Abraham, which you start to see in Genesis chapter 12. So in the book of Genesis, I think that word just really means the beginning. And we see some really interesting things here. Let me make one quick note. the book of Genesis was actually written after the book of Exodus. Exodus is where we start to see like the really beginnings of the Jewish people, and I'll get there in a second. But Genesis, although written later, is really about the origins of humankind. Oftentimes we call these first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis myth or primeval history. And so let's talk about that for a second. The book of Genesis begins with stories, not just one, stories of creation. In the first creation narrative, God creates all of humanity. And God does it in 7 days, and there's a certain structure to it. And in the second creation narrative, God creates two people whose names are very significant. Adam is a Hebrew word for humanity, and Eve is the Hebrew word for mother of life. And so you can see that this is not a scientific rendition of how creation happened, but rather that this is a mythical narrative that, if you know the definition of myth, that myths are profoundly true regardless of their factuality. And so God created these two people, and who represent, of course, all humanity, and gave them freedom, gave them responsibility, put them in a garden to till and to keep it, to be good stewards of this creation that God has given them. And similar to other myths at this time, there were two different trees. There was a tree of life, and then there was a tree of knowledge. And in this story, God is the one who has eternal life, and that God is the one who has divine knowledge. And what humans have are freedom. Humans have freedom. And what is really at stake here is, how are humans going to use that freedom? How are people going to be free agents in relationship to God? And so you probably know the story that the man and the woman, they eat of the fruit. They are kicked out of the garden for their own protection. And then you have, again, these beautiful myths, these beautiful epics of a flood and of God recreating his creation. So I oftentimes argue that there are actually 3 creation narratives in the book of Genesis. And pretty quickly after that, we start to see God developing a relationship, a covenant is what a lot of scholars define it, with Abraham, with this monotheist. And really the Jews kind of trace their lineage back to him. And there's this really kind of beautiful narrative. Read it in Genesis 12 and 13, where God calls to Abraham and just says, "Go, I will make of you a great nation." And we know that there were 2 great nations that really descended from Abraham, the Jewish tradition and then the Islamic tradition later on. And so the Jews believed that they were God's chosen people. And this is a universal relationship that God continued to, throughout history, to intervene in history, to be a co-creator in God's creation. And so then God chooses this person, Abraham, to be the father of many nations. And Abraham is really an example in the Jewish tradition of good obedience to God. Even though, when you look in all of the Jewish tradition, all of these patriarchs and matriarchs really do have some downfalls. But I think that's kind of the story of Judaism, that God takes imperfect people and works with them and calls them to be God's people. And so, if you know the story, God says to Abraham, "I will make of you a great nation." And Abraham says, "I don't see how. We are old. That's not going to happen." And so on the one hand, Abraham trusts God, but on the other hand, Abraham doesn't. And so he goes and he sleeps with his wife's servant, Hagar, and she has a child. Actually, before Sarah's child is born, she has a child, and his name is Ishmael. And then later on, Abraham has a child with Sarah, and his name is Isaac. Ishmael, again, Muslims really trace their lineage back to Ishmael, getting all the way to Abraham. And then Jews and Christians trace their lineage back to Isaac, getting back to Abraham as well. And the story continues that the Jewish people eventually get their own land. And I'm going to talk about that here in just a second. But there are several other religions around the Jews. So there were the Canaanites, and these people were polytheists. You hear about them often in the first several books of the Hebrew Bible. But the biggest tension is going to be with Egypt. These people who eventually became slaves to the Egyptians and to Pharaoh, they were an ethnic group. They were a tribe. And you know the story, I assume, that that there was this little boy, and his name was Moses. And Moses' name is really important because it means to draw out. And if you know that narrative, Moses' mother put him in the Nile River because the Pharaoh was trying to kill all of the boys. He wanted to wipe out a generation, and if you will. And so he was trying to kill all the boys. And so Moses' mother put him in the river. And if you know the story, Pharaoh's daughter actually draws him out of that water. Of course, he's going to be one who draws God's people out of Egypt, out of slavery. And so after several years, Moses actually has this encounter with God. And God says to Abraham, I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. And if you're a Christian, you might recognize some of this language where Jesus in the Gospel of John uses that distinct language of I am, trying to really go back to the Jewish narrative. But of course, there is a big tension in the book of Exodus between God and Moses and Pharaoh. In other words, it's a battle of the two gods. It's a battle of these two traditions. And so there are several different what we call plagues where God tells Moses to go to Pharaoh and say, let my people go and let them be liberated out of slavery. And so there's this battle between God, between the Jewish God Yahweh and Pharaoh and kind of the Egyptian deities. And the climax of this story, of course, is the Passover, where the Jewish people, the last and the greatest plague, were eventually liberated from slavery. And this is going to be the high watermark of the Jewish story, that the Jews were once slaves, but God liberated them from slavery. Remember that. They were once slaves, and God liberated them. And so once they are walking in the wilderness, God establishes a covenant with them, a relationship with them. God gives them the law. God gives them the commandments. In other words, God gives them the framework of this is what it means to be my people, and this is what it means to be in relationship with me. God promises these great things. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you. I will bless those who bless you. And yet that comes with a certain responsibility. And please, I don't have it on the slide here, but let me emphasize. The responsibility that the Jewish people had was to care for the poor, was to live a life of justice and righteousness, to act rightly and to care about justice. In other words, they were once slaves. Let me go back here. They were once slaves. They were once liberated by God. And so one of the biggest challenges that the Jews are going to have is how are we going to live our life, a political life and our religious life, in such a manner that we are co-creators, co-partners with God, and we act towards justice and righteousness. Pretty soon, the Jews, they have what we call First Temple Judaism, where David, the kind of greatest king of Israel, kind of really was the one who created a stable empire. And then Solomon is the one, David's son, who built the first temple. And the kings are really interesting in Judaism because the Jews had one God, and God said, I will be your God and you will be my people. And yet they said, well, we want to be like other nations. We want to look like other nations. And God says, no, you don't. And they said, yes, we do. And so eventually God gives them kings. So you need to pause here for just a second and realize that during this time, First Temple Judaism, there are going to be some really interesting historical events. And number one, probably one of the biggest, is that in 722 BCE, the Assyrian Empire came down from the north, trying to get down to Egypt, and they destroyed the northern kingdom. And they sent the best and the brightest into exile up to Assyria to live amongst these non-Jewish people. And then in 586, the Babylonians came down, and this is even more problematic for the Jews because the Babylonians came down and they destroyed the southern kingdom, they destroyed the temple, and they destroyed the Jewish nation of Jerusalem. So why did this happen? Well, of course, we can look at political reasons, but the main reason that the Jews said that this happened was that God was punishing them because they were not caring for the poor. They were not caring for the oppressed, and so they were not being God's people, and God sent these northern invaders down. And so we have what we call the diaspora, which is the dispersion of Jews into foreign lands. And be sure you understand this. I think the book does a pretty good job of talking about this. But the Jewish people were really an ethnic group in the northern parts, just north of Egypt, around 1700, 1800 BCE. They were, according to many scholars, liberated out of oppression from Egypt. And yet, in the 6th century BCE, they were dispersed. They lived among other nations. They lived among foreign lands. And although the Persians took over the Babylonians, and in 515 the Persian king Cyrus let the Jews go back down to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, many Jews stayed up north. Many Jews were, in a sense, victims of the diaspora, and so they lived among foreign lands. And so once they go back down to Jerusalem, you have this set of narratives. And in the Hebrew Bible, it's in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, where the people are trying to rebuild the temple. The people are trying to reinstate these proper Jewish acts, these proper Jewish beliefs and practices of caring for the poor, of living in right relationship with God, of worshiping correctly, and of praying correctly, and so on and so forth. And yet, the Jews were still under the oppression of other people. So ever since 722 BCE, the Jews had been oppressed by the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, and then a few other smaller tribes and smaller people. And then you have the Greeks, and then, of course, around the time of Jesus, you have the Romans. And so there was this revolt, and this is going to be important when we start talking about Hanukkah. And this is actually recorded not in the Hebrew Bible, but in the Apocrypha in the Christian Bible of the book of Maccabees. And there was this persecution, of course, that happened during the reign of Antiochus the Fourth, and it was pretty strong. And of course, there was this group of Jewish people who had had enough. They wanted to be liberated. They wanted to be free for once and for all. They wanted to be free, and so there was this revolt against their oppressor, because this is the Jewish story, right? That they were once oppressed, and yet God wants them to be free. So God is a liberator. God is one who liberates the oppressed out of their condition. And so there have been around, once we start moving towards the Common Era, there were more and more of these rebellions, more and more of this hope for a political and a military leader who would overthrow their oppressor and provide their freedom. And so, again, once we are kind of now in the 2nd century BCE, we start to see these different types of Judaism emerge, different sects. And so we have the Sadducees, who are the priests and the wealthy business class, whose intent was really to conserve the tradition and to really maintain it. And then you have the Pharisees, that these were a little bit more progressive, that they cared about the law, and they cared about maintaining the law, but in a much more kind of realistic way. And then you had this group of really kind of pious people called the Essenes. And these are people that gave us what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is a whole collection of books of the Hebrew Bible and of other literature around the years like 154 BCE, so kind of around that time. And so once the Jews, again, are now under Roman persecution or Roman rule, that there is this idea to try to reform Judaism. And so we start to see really in that 1st century BCE this idea of apocalyptic literature. There's this literature that we see in the book of Daniel and a few other parts in the Hebrew Bible where they hope for an anointed Messiah. They hope for a healer. And this leader is going to bring about the end of the world. This leader is going to bring about the end of time by using violence as a means to an end to overthrow the Romans, their oppressor, once and for all. And so there were several would-be messiahs. There were several before and after the life of Jesus. And the final and kind of the most successful military of the would-be messiahs was a revolt that took place in 132 to 135 of the Common Era, led by a man named Simon Bar Kokhba, which his name means the son of the stars. And once he failed, we started to see a major shift in Judaism. Of course, there was a pretty strong zealot movement, this anti-Roman militants around the time of the year 70 CE. And in fact, there was a war between the Jews and the Romans starting in the year 66. Well, that war ended with the destruction of the Jewish temple in the year 70 of the Common Era. And so that's kind of biblical Judaism. That's kind of the story of these people who were once oppressed, they were once slaved, and then they were liberated, then they were freed. And yet they always wanted that freedom, and they never really got it. They never really got their Messiah. They never really got their political hero who would overthrow the Romans, their oppressor. And so we start to see now a difference between biblical Judaism, which is kind of like the story of the Jewish people, from being created in God's people, and then being oppressed, and then being exiled, and then being liberated, and yet living under the oppressor. Now, here's kind of a really interesting side note. Look at the Jewish creation story one more time. The Jewish creation story is a backstory to the entire Jewish story. That here you have a God who creates people and who enters into a special relationship with them. They act freely. God gives them freedom. And then they kind of suffer, in a sense, from some of the effects of that freedom. And so God kicks them out of the land to protect them. And yet, in that creation story, in Genesis 3 and Genesis 4, God continues to be in relationship with them, to continue to call them back into existence. This is the story of the Jews. That God created them, that God liberated them from the oppressor. God gave them up to be free, okay, to have their own kings, to do life the way that they want to do it. And yet God always called them back. And so now we have Rabbinic Judaism. Now, Rabbinic Judaism, it takes place kind of after the destruction of the Jewish temple, when the Jews have to find a new way to worship and a new way to live. And so we no longer have the temple. We have a whole bunch of these, what we call synagogues. And we have no longer priests who perform the sacrifices in the temple. We have rabbis. And the rabbis are the ones who are going to inherit the Pharisaic tradition, the tradition of the law, the tradition of the prophets. And then they are going to interpret those law and the prophets as to how we then live life, how Jews live life. And so look at kind of some of the main tenets of the Jewish tradition. And one of them is this third point here, Midrash. Midrash is the ongoing rabbinic biblical tradition and interpretation. Again, the best modern analogy I have for this is the standard, and that's not the right word that I'm thinking of, the whole body of knowledge that we have from the Supreme Court. I really like following law, and I think that's really interesting. But the Supreme Court has really set a certain standard and a certain tradition of how people interpret law in our country. And that's kind of what the tradition has really done here, that Rabbinic Judaism is this ongoing, evolving tradition that looks back at the Jewish narrative, the Jewish law, and tries to unpack and to argue, what does it mean to be a Jewish person today? And so we have a whole bunch of the early definition or the early development of the Talmud, of this ongoing set of body of texts that are really about the interpretation of the Jewish tradition. And of course, that this has evolved over time. So what is the role that the European Enlightenment played in the development of Judaism? Well, there were several kind of key events, and some of them I find interesting are the center of authority, of where Judaism really held its base. And in the 8th century, it was in Baghdad. Of course, that's going to change very quickly because of the spread of Islam. But then it's going to move to Babylon. Again, it's also interesting that the Babylonians were the ones who destroyed the Jewish temple. But one thing I want you to also notice here is notice that Judaism, as the effects of the invasion in 722 and 586, is really a dispersed group of people now. The diaspora has really dispersed the Jews ethnically and religiously, kind of all throughout the Mediterranean, kind of in many ways throughout the Middle East, and then even as far west as Spain. And so over time, of course, Judaism has evolved. It had to respond to the anti-Semitism that arose in some early Christian communities. And of course, then it had to deal with some of the victims and some of the byproducts of the Crusades, where where some Christians were trying to reclaim the Holy Land, to rid that from Jews and Muslims. And then you start to see kind of, again, throughout the Middle Ages, the Jews are blamed for certain things. For the Great Plague in the 14th century, the Jews were kicked out of Spain in the latter part of the 15th century. And then what I think is interesting historically, because I think 20th century history is also interesting, that Jews in Italy and Germany were forced into ghettos. And that took place in the 16th century. We're going to see that again in the 20th century, of course, as well. And I'm going to skip over this. I think that the textbook does a pretty good job of this, but there are different sects of Judaism. There are different types of Judaism. And this is really the mystical sect of Judaism that goes back to the Hellenistic period, kind of the 2nd and 3rd century BCE, where we start to see a really Greek and a really Hellenistic influence on Judaism. So Judaism today, of course, the Enlightenment has really had a kind of a positive and then yet a negative influence for modern Jews. Number one, the French Revolution was good. So it really led to this greater freedom for the Jewish people. And there was also around this time like a Jewish Enlightenment. There were these people who would really use reason and as a source of knowledge, as an epistemological foundation. And so these people were not only the foundation for religious knowledge and religious faith, but also secular knowledge and secular faith as well. And so around this time too, we have kind of this structure of different types of Judaism. So we have the Orthodox tradition, which is the tradition that is really going to emphasize this common practice and this tradition. And then we're going to start to see what we call Reform Judaism. And I'm going to touch on that here in just a little bit. And of course, I don't think that we can talk about Judaism as a religion and as an ethnic group of people without mentioning one of the lowest watermarks, not only of the religion, but also of I think kind of world history. And this is the extermination of over 6 million Jews during the time of World War II, and a little bit before and a little bit after. So we start to see the reemergence of anti-Semitism in the early part of the 19th century in Western Europe. And this took place politically, this took place religiously, and so on and so forth. So after the Nazi Party, of course, rose to power after the destruction of Germany and all the reparations that they had to pay, there was this idea and this political power that became very, very attractive to some people, and not all, but some people. And so Jews, again, were moved into the ghettos, and they were forced, as you know, to wear the Star of David as badges. And if you've never been to Germany, I would, and if you have the chance, I would really recommend you going to some of the concentration camps. They are difficult. They are hard to describe in many ways. But I really would recommend you going. And I hope that you have read books around this period, and especially books by religious and non-religious people alike. And then now, what does kind of contemporary Judaism look like? Well, there are several different branches. There's conservative Judaism, there's Reform Judaism, which is really quite progressive, and we'll get there in a second. But then there are also some Zionists, and what these people are arguing is that God wants to reunite the nation of Israel, just like has been the promise all along. And so in the 1947, of course, you guys know that the United Nations partitioned part of Palestine. And in 1948, Israel was declared an independent nation. And this has been an ongoing battle between the Jews, or the Israel as a nation now has really had with its neighbors. And this is continuing. You know, I'm recording this in July of 2018, and the United States, under the current administration, has just moved its embassy into Jerusalem, which is really interesting. There's a lot of political things there, and a lot of you guys have touched on that in your contemporary what's the word I'm looking for? your contemporary events, the stuff that we read in the media. So what is really going on in the Torah? So it's very difficult to talk about like the key tenets of the Jewish faith, but the Jewish people are really called to keep sacred time, to keep sacred space, and to be God's people, whatever that means in the different forms of the tradition. But some of the core beliefs are really about the strict monotheism of Abraham, that the Jews believe in one God, that this is the creator God, this is the God who caused all things to come into existence, and this is kind of at the core of Judaism. One of the core prayers in Judaism is called the Shema, and it begins with the phrase, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one." And then it goes on. You can read it in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, and so on and so forth. Secondly, not only is God one, not only is God the creator, but God is to be loved. And so here is the Shema that I just kind of quoted. Shema Israel, hear, which is what the word means, Shema. So hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, or the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. Jesus, when he, in the Christian tradition, he adds, and with all your mind as well. Now, notice kind of what does it mean to be Jewish here? Take to your heart these instructions, of which I charge you this day. Impress them on your children. Recite them when you stand or stay at home, and when you're away, when you lie down, and when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your head or on your hand, and let them serve as a symbol on your forehead. Inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. If you guys ever go to a synagogue or to a temple, you will see these little symbols on all of the doorposts, because the Jewish people, not only are they people who hear and who listen to God, excuse me, but they are a people who really keep these practices. And so there is, of course, this idea in Judaism that humans are created in God's image, every human. The humans, therefore, mirror God's qualities, and all people then are created equal. So marriage, of course, and the human body are very strongly honored in Judaism. Of course, the Jews have 613 commandments in the biblical tradition. But one thing I think is really interesting here is that the Jewish people, you need to remember that the Jewish people were not just a religion, but they were people, and they established laws, just like any country, just like any group of people established laws. They did this too. And so I think one of the biggest misconceptions about Judaism or about the Hebrew Bible is that it's just full of laws. And that couldn't be, I think, further from the truth. The Jewish people are a people, of course, who are bound by a covenant, a relationship. And one of the ways in which you live into that relationship is by living into these laws and practicing these laws. Of course, in Judaism, much like any other religion, they have a very real-world experience of suffering. Okay, why is it that humans suffer? The book of Job offers a really compelling kind of discussion on this. They suffer because that is what it means to be alive in this world. It might not sound like the best example, the best argument for you. I think that there are a lot of Americans that say everything happens for a reason. I don't think you would ever hear a Jewish person saying that. I think you would hear a Jewish person say that the suffering is a part of creation, and that God is one who liberates people from suffering, that God is with people who suffer. But God is also the God of the universe. And so I know that you and I, when life gets stressful and when life gets busy, oh my gosh, I'm suffering. I don't think that you really hear that in a lot of the Jewish tradition. And what's interesting is that they are people who have suffered greatly. So God is like a shepherd. This is the pinnacle, maybe the chief psalm, Psalm 23, that the Jews say, "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He revives my soul." And even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You set a table before me, and you anoint my head with oil. And so there's this beautiful metaphor, this beautiful parable in the Hebrew Bible that God is a shepherd, that God is one who walks and cares with God's people. So some of the major practices. This is, I think, what is really kind of the easy aspect to understand about Judaism, and so I'm going to leave some of this up to you. But the Jewish people are who they are because they participate in certain practices. Okay, I know that there are other religions that are focused more on practices, and then there are other religions that focus more on belief. I kind of think that Judaism is a hybridization between those two. And so there are certain practices that you do from birth, okay, all the way through death. And you're going to see this in different traditions. Now, not every Jewish person does all these. Not every Jewish person, for example, keeps kosher. Many do, not always, not everybody. Again, it's quite diverse. But one of the big practices that Jews do is they keep the Sabbath. The Sabbath is kind of two things. One, it's a sign of God's covenant with God's people, but it's also a way to rest and to remember that life is really the center of what we do. And so we spend 6 days working. We spend 6 days doing a ton of things, but we spend that seventh day resting. And I think this is something that a lot of the other traditions need to learn from Judaism. So the spiritual New Year, the Jewish New Year, begins with Rosh Hashanah and then Yom Kippur. So Rosh Hashanah is the New Year, and this is it marks a several-day time period of spiritual renewal. And one of the things that they do here is they think about their own sin, and they think about their own ways in which they have offended and hurt other people. And they during this time period, they really imagine, like, well, how can I change? How can I be different? How can I not hurt these people? And so they generally do a good job of going and confessing to those people and to, in a sense, kind of asking for forgiveness. And then they have Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, where if you live by a Jewish temple or a synagogue, that you're going to see a lot of traffic on that day, because this is a day where religious and non-religious Jews alike, they go to temple. So again, Sukkot is a fall festival that Jews really do. It's over several days that they commemorate the journey from Egypt to their land of Canaan. And then Hanukkah is what I think a lot of you maybe in the West might think of, like, oh, this is the highest of holy days in Judaism, and that's really not the case. It really has kind of been hijacked by Christmas, much like Christianity's Christmas has really been higher. The birth of Jesus has been hijacked by Christmas too. And so the Hanukkah, if we go back to the story of the Maccabean revolt, is a really interesting holiday where the Jews remember the 8 nights of the Feast of the Dedication. That in order to do this feast, they needed light from the oil, but they only had enough oil to last the candle for 1 day, and yet the candle lasted for 8 days. And so around the time of Hanukkah, you're going to see the menorah, which I tried putting in the background here, in a lot of Jewish public places, but also a lot of Jewish homes as well. Purim, and then, of course, Passover. Again, I think the book does a pretty good job with that, so I'm going to let you with this. And then finally, we have kind of contemporary Judaism. There are several different branches of Judaism out east, in the Middle East, and then in the West. So take a look at that. But then I think kind of for your purposes here in the United States, there are kind of 3 different traditions. There's the Reform Judaism, which is really quite progressive. You're going to see it in many churches. There's actually a Reformed church over in Southwest Fort Worth. You're going to see conservative Judaism, where they maintain a lot of the Jewish laws and the practices, and yet they use a lot of modern means of historical scholarship. And then you're going to have Orthodox Judaism, which is in many ways kind of like the most traditional form of Judaism as well. I like that the textbook talks a lot about gender issues regarding to the patriarchal nature of religion. And so we do see some feminists coming back to and having very public voices regarding Judaism. For example, there's a lady I follow on Twitter, and she is a rabbi. She's a leader of her congregation, and she is very politically and religiously active. And this is interesting that in a lot of religions today, we start to see a far more inclusive tone regarding both women and men. And so I want to finish there. The Jewish people are a people who have an ongoing narrative, an ongoing story. And I think that story is really the pinnacle way to understand this religion. That God is one who created God's people to be God's people. There's this quote in the book of Exodus that says that you will be a holy nation and a priestly kingdom. So God created this people. He liberated them out of oppression so that they might be people who know what it means to be oppressed and live accordingly to work towards the liberation of other people. Sadly, they have experienced quite a bit of oppression in their history, and yet God continually calls them to be voices of liberation in today's world, and then I think in also the world as we see it in the next several hundred and thousand years.